Here is Sailor Studio 027, a black ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This may seem straightforward as this is a black ink, and if you only use fountain pen friendly paper, it is. There can be some tone variation on the more extreme nibs, and in those cases, the shading is also not really there. It's generally a solid black, but it's a little bit of a tone variation. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it tends to look a bit gray and can feel disappointing. So I think this is a major issue depending on what paper you normally write on. But I write on a bunch of different papers throughout the day, and I'm not a fan of the gray that I'm getting on the non-fountain pen friendly papers.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Pelikan M1005.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we see gray, not black. It doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, though. We can see a couple of moments where it does shade a little bit darker, like rock on the second line where the K is a little bit darker, the on the second line where the T is a little lighter than the he. Even little starts a little darker and gets lighter on the LE at the end, but this is gray looking and it should be black. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It's black. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It looks like a fantastic black on the page. I wish it came out this way all the time, but it doesn't. But I do like what I'm getting right here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. It's black, with no feathering, no spread, no shading, performing just as I would prefer a black ink to do. Solid, crisp lines the whole way. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the medium or the wet fine. We definitely get some gray going on here. It's not feathering or spreading, but we're definitely getting some of the gray. Look at left afloat on the first line. The EF starts showing a little bit of the gray as it does shade down to it. Same with afloat. The A is a gray. The F starts to become a black. The LAS becomes gray again. It's during the downstroke of the T that it becomes black once again. Not a good thing to me for a black ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelikan M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine, which is gray and not black. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does have some light shading as a gray ink. Unfortunately, it's supposed to be black. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, still mostly black, some gray going on because there is some feathering, or sorry, some shading going on. If you see barrel on the second line, it's during the loop of the B that it becomes a gray. It's black into the A, gray into the R's, black again at the EL at the end. Not being very happy here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It's gray and not black. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. I don't like that it shades. It should be solid in what's going on, and I like this paper. I don't like how this is looking on it. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, which is just a little bit off of being black and like a dark gray with no feather, no spread. It does have a moment or two of some light shading that's going on, which is unfortunate because it's black. Looking at the back of the page, though, there is no bleeding or ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. More is a very dark gray now, still not black, but this paper often, if an ink is not completely opaque, it might have an effect on it. I'll give it a little leeway there. Other than that, it's been gray on all the non-fountain pen friendly papers. It doesn't spread, doesn't feather, does have shading. You see the shading in shallow water quite well, where the S is lighter, the HA get a bit darker. The first L is a little lighter than the second L into the O. It's the W that lightens up. Now water starts lighter as a gray and becomes more of a black on the TER at the end. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. It does make me very happy with what I'm seeing. Thank you for what you're doing here. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, it does not disappoint in any way looking at the black ink on this page. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It has just a couple of moments you can really spot, like was on the first line is a bit lighter than even underneath it, which is a little lighter than well underneath that, but it's not huge in the shading that's going on. It's mostly the darker tone, but the darker tone is still just a little bit lighter to make it look like it's a very dark gray. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, so it's doing very well there.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades. Yes, it's a black and not a gray, but it's coming up as a darker gray that shades into black, like Forgotten on the second line, where the F is darker than the O, that's kind of a gray. R becomes black again. G-O become gray. T-H-E-R, black. It's really not horrible. It's just that I was really expecting black. Now, it stands out with no problems against this quad rule. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, no shading. Beautiful performance as a black ink. Really nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It is beautiful black ink the whole time. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, no spread, very light moments of shading, which are unfortunate. Unfortunate that it's really looking like a dark gray. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diatramentis Document Black. Here is Monteverde Black Ash. Here is Omos Black. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Black of Score.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little flatter and duller and a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now this paper tends to do that, so I go into this kind of expecting it. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. While I'm not 100% happy with what I'm getting, I could actually live with this because I know how the paper tends to affect ink as it goes down. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, meaning it's like a darker gray now. No feather, no spread, light bits of shading going on. Once again, I can actually handle it, understanding that this paper doesn't give the truest color of that ink, so I'm not 100% disappointed here. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, but it's just a little bit short of being black. However, again, just to say it, the paper tends to do that, so I'm not disappointed at all. I actually prefer how this nib and the last nib did on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit lighter than it was with the medium, about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, almost nothing for shading, only one or two darker areas that are there. Now this almost looks like a 2B pencil to me on the paper. So I guess if you like 2B pencils on this paper, this could be a really good ink to use. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. Continue your notes back here for good paper usage.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Noodler's Matahari Cordial. Here is Diamine Cerise. Here is Sailor Soleil. Here is Waterman Audacious Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still a very dark black, very dark gray, but much more towards a black. It kind of, I'd let it pass. I'd let this pass. It does feather, it does spread, neither are out of control, neither are a major issue. It does have little spots of shading that go on, not something I would be looking for in the gray, but I think the performance on this paper is kind of okay. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread and it does have a couple of lighter areas. Not really shading so much, but a couple of areas that came up just a little bit lighter. I'm going to call this absolutely serviceable on this paper. I think you could use it and not be wildly disappointed. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, meaning it's a dark gray. Sure, it feathers, sure, it spreads. Both of those, I think, are kind of under control here that you could use them. There's no shading that's going on. I don't see any real tone variation going on. So with that, again, I think we have pretty good performance here. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread and it does not shade. Again, we come to the it's serviceable here. I think this is usable. I don't think you would be entirely disappointed. I would be, but you might not be. Everybody's mileage will vary depending on the paper that they regularly use and what they're used to seeing. I'm just kind of a paper snob. Looking at the back of the page, you can see this ink got quite deep into the toilet paper, copy paper, but nothing bled through touching the other side. I think it did incredibly well with the wet fine. Soft fine. The medium and the broad did get quite a bit deeper in there. I don't think you could use the back of the page with the medium at all. But I think the others, you could stand a chance of writing back there because the ghosting isn't out of control, and I think you could read what was on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine comes off as gray with some shading. Not good for a black ink. Now the wet fine and the medium, both beautiful black with no shading. The broad returns to being gray and to being disappointing. So I think the best way to go is to get a good black out of this is from a wet nib that isn't too broad. I think the broader nibs are more likely to show some of that gray, unless that's what you want.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.